I did not know what I had done for 11 days. That is the part people never include when they retell it. They tell you about the succession chamber, about the high counsel's face, about the queen rising to speak in a room that had not heard that particular law invoked in 190 years. They skip the 11 days I spent in the Imperial Medical Annex not knowing anything was wrong, running my panels, logging my results, eating my meals in the staff corridor, because the vel'kareth canteen did not carry anything a human digestive system could manage with confidence. I am Davin Sorrell. I was 41 years old when it happened. I was a compact military physician, seconded to the vel'kareth Sovereign Citadel as part of the interspecies medical exchange program, the first human physician to hold that posting in the program's 6-year history. My predecessor had been a Drenathi physiologist named Kelvin Orash, who had lasted 14 months and written a 30-page exit report that I had read twice on the transit in. The report's central finding was that the vel'kareth did not like being examined, that their court structure made honest medical documentation nearly impossible, and that any physician assigned to the posting should expect to spend most of their time completing paperwork that would be reviewed by the High Counsel's office before it was filed. Kelvin had not enjoyed the posting. I thought about that report a great deal in the first 3 weeks. Then I stopped thinking about it and started doing the work. The vel'kareth are tall. They average about 2.5 meters at full adult height, with a build that reads as lean until you see one move, and then you understand that the leanness is not fragility but a different kind of structural logic, the way a tension cable is not thick but will hold a bridge. Their skin runs warm, amber golds and burnished coppers and deep earth browns, with a slight iridescence in good light that I had read about in the medical literature, and still was not prepared for when I first saw it up close. Their eyes are light, silver grays and pale blues and milky whites, large and set slightly wider than a human face, with pupils that dilate in a vertical orientation in low light. Their hair grows in a range that maps roughly to their skin undertone, coppers and reds and deep chestnuts, sometimes with a natural highlight that looks almost metallic in direct sunlight. Queen Sarath vel'kareth Orvin was all of this at its most precise. She was 44 standard years, which mapped to approximately 38 in human terms. Her skin was warm amber gold. Her hair was a deep copper red, worn in the formal court braid, a complex arrangement that her personal attendant reset every 3rd morning, and which I had learned to recognize because when the braid was freshly set it meant the queen had a full formal schedule, and when it was beginning to loosen it meant she had been in session too long and her blood pressure would be elevated. Her eyes were silver gray, pale enough to look almost white in certain angles, with a precision in them that I found unsettling for the first 2 weeks and then found useful. She noticed things. She noticed them quietly and completely, the way a surveyor notes terrain, not for drama but for record. She was not easy to work with. Not hostile, not dismissive exactly. But she had a manner of engaging with the medical process that was entirely vel'kareth, procedural, correct, minimally expressive. She came to the medical annex on schedule. She answered the questions I asked. She did not ask questions in return. She complied with every examination with the cooperative precision of someone who had been told this was a necessary obligation and had decided to fulfill it efficiently. I did not have access to her personal medical history for the first month. I had access to the official court health record, which was a document of remarkable thoroughness and remarkable blankness, full of notation dates and clearance stamps, and almost no actual physiological data. Kelvin had noted this in his exit report. I had read that section 3 times. I worked around it. Compact protocol gave me latitude on the methods, and I used that latitude carefully, building a baseline picture of the Queen's health through observation and inference where direct data was restricted. She was healthy. Her cardiovascular indicators were excellent. Her stress indices were elevated, not dangerously, but measurably above the vel'kareth physiological baseline described in the medical literature. I noted this in the annex log and said nothing about it to the court coordinator. The routine compatibility panel was a different matter. It was part of the health survey, a standard cross-species protocol that the compact required for any sovereign or head of state receiving a compact physician. The purpose was narrow and administrative, to establish a full biological baseline so that in a medical emergency, any compact physician called to assist would have the correct reference data for drug interactions, surgical approaches, transfusion compatibility. It was not a diagnostic tool for anything beyond that. It was paperwork with a biological component. I had explained this to the court coordinator in the first week. The coordinator had reviewed it, passed it to the High Counsel's review office, and returned it 3 weeks later with a conditional approval. The panel could proceed under the health survey designation, with the results filed first to the vel'kareth Sovereign Medical Archive, and then to the Compact's Exchange Registry. I ran the panel on the 42nd day. The Queen was seated on the examination platform in the annex's main bay. She was wearing the formal court robe, ivory and copper, with the vel'kareth sovereign seal embroidered at the collar in gold thread, because she had come from a morning session and had not yet changed. Her braid was set. Her posture was the precise upright she always carried when she was in court mode. Her silver-gray eyes were on the middle distance, the way they went when she was managing an internal schedule. I told her what I was doing as I worked. Not in detail, she did not want detail, I had learned that early, but in short plain statements. Running the compatibility baseline now. The sensor array takes about 8 minutes. The results go to the archive tonight. She gave the minimal acknowledgement she always gave. A slight incline of the head, eyes not shifting from the middle distance, the barest compression of the lips that I had come to read as understood. The panel ran for 8 minutes and 40 seconds. Then the annex system produced a result I had not seen before and did not immediately understand. The readout was in vel'kareth medical notation, which I could read at about 70% fluency. What I was looking at appeared to be a compatibility index, a cross-species compatibility register that the vel'kareth medical system ran as a routine comparison subroutine whenever it processed biological data from 2 separate species in the same session. The index had a standard range. The vel'kareth literature described it as a measure of biological resonance, which was not a concept with a direct compact equivalent, but which I understood roughly to mean the degree to which 2 organisms' biological systems could operate in sustained proximity without interference. Most cross-species pairs scored low. A score above a certain threshold triggered a secondary subprotocol. I did not know what the secondary subprotocol was. The score was above the threshold. I looked at the result for perhaps 30 seconds. Then I looked at the Queen. She was still in the middle distance. The annex system was running the secondary subprotocol. I did not know what it was running. I made a note in the session log, secondary subprotocol initiated, source unknown, pending review of vel'kareth medical literature, and said nothing. I told her the panel was complete. She gave the slight incline of the head. She left the annex. I spent 4 hours that afternoon in the medical literature, trying to understand what the secondary subprotocol was. By the end of the 4th hour, I had found a partial translation, a footnote in a vel'kareth medical compendium published approximately 60 years prior. The footnote referenced a biological process called the vel'kareth sovereign bloom. It was described as a dormant succession mechanism carried in the royal bloodline. It required 2 things to activate: a sovereign with the specific genetic marker and a biologically compatible mate. The footnote noted that the sovereign bloom had not been activated in living memory. The last recorded activation was in the reign of Queen Sereth II, approximately 190 standard years prior. The footnote did not say what activating the sovereign bloom meant in practical terms. I closed the compendium and sat with that information for a long time. Then I opened the annex filing system and reviewed what had been transmitted to the Sovereign Medical Archive. The secondary subprotocol had filed automatically. It had filed to the archive. It had also, and I found this in the transmission log only after I searched specifically for it, filed to the High Counsel's Review Office, which was the office that reviewed all medical data under the conditional approval I had received in the first week. The High Counsel's office had received the filing 2 hours ago. I read that transmission record 3 times. Then I closed the filing system and went to find something to eat and think about what I was going to do. The court coordinator arrived at the annex the following morning at 6:30, which was 40 minutes before my scheduled start. He was a careful man named vel'sorath, 3 years in the coordinator post, efficient, professional, polite in a way that never became warm. He told me that the High Counsel would like to meet with me at my earliest convenience. His expression was completely level. His hands, clasped in front of him, were not. I said this morning. The High Counsel was vel'sorath. He was 68 standard years, which was senior even for vel'kareth, and he carried his age in the careful economy of his movements rather than in any visible frailty. He was tall even for his species, with dark amber skin and close-cropped silver hair and eyes so pale they were almost colorless. He had held his position for 23 years. In those 23 years, every decision of consequence in the vel'kareth sovereignty had passed through his office at some point, and most of them had emerged shaped by his preferences. He was not the sovereign, but he had the kind of authority that operates most effectively when it is not announced. He received me in his formal office on the 3rd level, a room of gray stone and high windows, with no unnecessary furniture and no decorative elements beyond the vel'kareth seal in the wall above his desk. He did not offer me a seat. He stood behind his desk and looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. He said, "You understand what you have done." I said, "I am still reviewing the vel'kareth medical literature. I would like to understand the sovereign bloom more completely before I make any assessment." He looked at me the way someone looks at a smaller animal that has just said something unexpected. Then he said, "What you have done, Physician Sorrel, is activate a succession clause in the vel'kareth Sovereign Charter that has not operated for 190 years. The sovereign bloom is not a medical curiosity. It is a legally binding biological trigger. It means the Queen's succession cycle has initiated. It means the ancient charter requires a formal royal bonding claim before the bloom cycle completes within 60 standard days. And it means the claim is yours to make." I said, "I ran a routine compatibility panel." He said, "Yes, that is the problem." I stayed with that for a moment, then I said, "What are the Queen's options?" He said, "The Queen's options are not your concern." I said, "With respect, High Counsel, she is my patient. Her options are precisely my concern." He looked at me again. This time the look was different, not contempt, exactly, but a reassessment of some kind. The kind of reassessment a man performs when he has been expecting one kind of opponent and found a different kind. He said the Queen had 3 options. The first was to accept the bonding claim from a vel'kareth-approved party. The High Counsel had a candidate prepared, a senior noble whose lineage was appropriate, who had been waiting for this kind of opening in the succession question for some time. The second was to challenge the validity of the activation in the succession chamber, arguing that the dormant clause had been superseded by subsequent sovereign charters. The third was to allow the bloom to complete without a bonding claim, which the ancient charter described in terms that translated approximately to sovereign dissolution, the end of her direct line, and the transfer of governance to the Regency Council. The High Counsel's preferred outcome was the second option, combined with the installation of a regent from among the approved candidates. He had legal scholars from 4 systems reviewing the dormant clause. I said, "What is the Queen's preference?" He said the Queen had not expressed a preference. I said I would like to speak with her. He said that would not be appropriate. I said I was her physician. There was a pause. It was the specific kind of pause that happens when a person realizes that one particular category of access is going to be difficult to deny without causing a different problem. The vel'kareth court ran on protocol. The physician's access to their patient was one of the oldest and most clearly defined protocols in any legal system. The High Counsel's office reviewed medical data. It did not supersede medical access. He said he would arrange a meeting. He said it with the precise care of a man filing a document he does not want filed but cannot decline to file. I said thank you and left. The Queen received me in the annex the following afternoon. She had requested the annex specifically, not her private chambers, not the formal reception room. The annex, which was my room, my equipment, my territory. I noted that and filed it. She came in the formal braid, but the robe was not the court ivory. It was a darker color, a deep amber brown that read as close to civilian dress as I had seen on her. She sat on the examination platform the way she always sat, upright, precise, silver gray eyes level. She was quiet for a moment after the door closed. Then she said, "I am told you want to understand my options." I said, "I want to make sure you understand them. There is a difference." She looked at me with the precision she always used, and I could not read what was in the look. Then she said, "The High Counsel believes you will be persuaded to withdraw. He thinks you are a reasonable man, and that a reasonable man will understand that this situation is not one a compact physician should be entangled in." I said, "I am not entangled. I ran a panel. I documented the result correctly. I don't have a position on what the result means for the succession." She said, "You understand that one of the options the High Counsel describes involves you making a formal claim." I said I understood that. She said, "And you have no position on that either." I said, "It is not my succession. It is yours. I have a position only on whether you are making this decision with full information and without pressure that compromises your ability to choose freely." She was quiet for a long time after that. The annex was quiet. Outside, the Citadel's upper levels were running their morning maintenance cycle. I could hear the ventilation systems adjusting, but in the annex bay it was still. Her eyes had moved off the level line she kept for formal interactions and were somewhere slightly lower, slightly more interior. I had not seen that before. She said, "You are a strange man, Physician Sorrel." I said, "I've been told." She almost did something with her mouth. Not quite a smile. A faint movement at the corner that might have been something close to it. Then she said, "The High Counsel's candidate would be acceptable. He is competent and his lineage is appropriate. The challenge on the dormant clause would be more complex and would require me to argue publicly against a mechanism I believe is legally sound. And the third option, the dissolution, is not one I am prepared to accept." I said, "So the acceptable option is the High Counsel's candidate." She said, "It is the most straightforward option." I said, "That is not the same answer." She looked at me again. This time there was something in the look that I did not have a word for, not surprise, not quite, something more considered than surprise. She said, "No, it is not." I said nothing. She said nothing. The annex ventilation ran its cycle. Then she said, "The ancient charter's language is specific. The bonding claim is not a political instrument. It is a personal one. It is supposed to represent a genuine recognition. The vel'kareth word is vel'sorath, which does not translate directly, but it carries something like the weight of being seen and named as real. The mechanism was designed to ensure the sovereign's succession was rooted in something true rather than something politically convenient." I said, "And the High Counsel's candidate?" She said, "He has not looked at me once since the activation filing was received." The room was quiet again. I thought about that. I thought about the way she had said it, not with bitterness, not with anger, with the same precise observational register she used for everything else. A fact, reported accurately. I said, I have a question that is outside my medical mandate, and you are not obligated to answer it. She said, ask it. I said, when you came to the annex for the session where the panel ran, when you were sitting on that platform and I was working, what were you thinking about? It was a strange question. I knew it was strange when I said it. She looked at me for a moment with the silver-gray eyes that caught light and gave almost nothing back. Then she said, I was thinking that this was the only hour in the day when no one required anything from me. That in here, I was a patient and not a sovereign. That you spoke to me in plain sentences and did not arrange your words around what you wanted me to feel. I said I didn't know that. She said, no, you didn't. She stood then, the formal, precise rise she always used, the kind that seemed effortless and probably required significant practice, and she adjusted the amber robe at the collar. Then she said, I need to think. I will tell vel'sorath when I am ready to meet with you again. I said, of course. She walked to the door. At the door she paused, not turning. She said, the plain sentences, physician Sorrel, keep using them. Then she left. I sat in the annex for a while. Then I opened the medical literature and went back to reading about the sovereign bloom. The bloom, I learned over the following days, was a more complex mechanism than the footnote had suggested. It was not a metaphor. It was a genuine biological process, a cascade of hormonal and cellular changes in the vel'kareth royal bloodline that initiated when the compatibility trigger fired. The changes were not visible. They were internal, but they were measurable, and the medical compendium's older volumes described them in detail that the more recent literature, the literature published after the last activation, when the mechanism had been dormant so long it was effectively theoretical, did not. The older volumes were more useful than I had expected. They had been written by vel'kareth physicians of a different era, people who had actually observed the bloom in operation, rather than theorizing about a process they had only read about. Their clinical language was precise and free of the political hesitation that ran through the newer material. They described the bloom's biological stages in the kind of grounded physiological terms I could work with. The initial cascade indicators, the secondary hormonal shifts that marked the transition from activation to progression, the tertiary markers that the ancient charter called the completion signs. I read those volumes 3 times each. I took notes. I cross-referenced what I was observing in the Queen's daily indicators against the stage descriptions. Everything matched the pattern the old physicians had documented. The bloom was proceeding exactly as the old texts described. That was useful information. It was also information that made the decision window much clearer. The most significant thing I learned was that the bloom was reversible, but only within the first 30 standard days. After 30 days, the biological cascade became self-sustaining, and the succession cycle would complete with or without a formal bonding claim. The charter's 60-day window for the claim was generous. It had been set when travel between vel'kareth territories took weeks. In modern terms, the decision window was essentially the first 30 days. After that, the bloom would complete on its own terms. We were on day 18. I documented this in the annex log. I also prepared a summary for the Queen, precise, plain, 4 paragraphs. No language I had not verified in the medical compendium. I gave it to vel'sorath to forward. I did not tell the High Counsel's office about the 30-day threshold. The medical data was the Queen's. It was hers to share or not share as she chose. The High Counsel called me to his office again on day 22. He had new information. His legal scholars had reviewed the dormant clause and had found, he told me, 3 separate grounds on which to argue that the sovereign bloom activation was not legally binding under the current charter. He was prepared to bring a formal challenge before the succession chamber within the week. He said this with the careful precision of a man who has done the preparation work and wants you to understand that the preparation is complete. Then he said, I am prepared to offer you a facilitated departure. Your compact posting agreement has a 30-day early termination provision. You would be cleared of any secondary obligation under the Charter on the grounds that the activation was the result of an administrative process undertaken in good faith under an incomplete information set. The compact would receive a full diplomatic communication. Your record would show no irregularity. I looked at him for a moment. I said, You're asking me to leave. He said, I'm offering you a clean exit from a situation that is not of your making and is not to your benefit. I said, What happens to the Queen if the legal challenge fails? He said, It will not fail. I said, What happens if it does? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, If the challenge fails, the Charter requires the bloom cycle to complete. Without a bonding claim from an eligible party, the dissolution provision takes effect. The Regency Council assumes governance. The Queen steps down from the sovereign position. I said, And the High Council's candidate, is he prepared to file a claim? He said, That option remains available and would be exercised if necessary. I said, Is the Queen aware of that option? He said, The Queen is being counseled appropriately. I said, That is not an answer. The pale eyes looked at me for a long time. Then he said, Physician Sorrel, you are a compact medical officer on a seconded posting. You have no standing in vel'kareth succession law. You have no formal position in this court. You are here on a professional mandate that does not extend to political involvement. I said, I am her physician. I have professional standing, and I have a question I would like to ask the Queen before the legal challenge is filed. He said, She is not available for additional consultations. I said, Then I will send her a note through the medical record system, which is her record and to which you have review access but not blocking authority. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, very precisely, You understand what you are considering. I said, I'm considering filing a bonding claim under the ancient charter. He said, You are a human. I said, The charter predates the compact. It doesn't specify species. He said, It was written for vel'kareth. I said, It was written for whoever carried the compatible marker. The medical literature is clear on that. The compatibility index does not have a species exclusion. The High Council looked at me the way a man looks at something he did not plan for and is now calculating how to contain. Then he said, And on what basis would you file such a claim? The vel'sorath is a genuine recognition. The charter is explicit. It is not a political instrument. If you file under false premises, the challenge will succeed on grounds of bad faith and the dissolution proceeds. I said, I know. He said, Then you understand the stakes. I said yes and left. The note I sent through the medical record system was 4 lines. I said I had reviewed the full medical literature on the sovereign bloom and that she should have access to everything I found before any legal proceeding moved forward. I said I had reviewed the charter's language on the vel'sorath. I said I had a question for her that required an honest answer, and that the answer, whatever it was, would determine what I did next. I said, In the annex, in the plain sentences, was that real? She sent a response through the same system. It was 2 lines. She said, Yes. She said, Ask your question. I requested a meeting. vel'sorath arranged it within the hour. I did not tell him what it was for. She came to the annex again. This time the braid was half set, one side in the formal arrangement, one side loosening in the way I associated with long sessions. The amber-brown robe again. She sat on the examination platform and looked at me with the silver-gray precision and waited. I said, I want to understand something before I make any decision. I want to understand what you want, not what the charter requires, not what the High Council advises, what you want. She said, "That is a question the vel'kareth court does not ask its sovereign." I said, "I know, I'm asking it anyway." She was quiet for a long time. The annex light came through the high window at a low angle. It was late afternoon, the gold hour light that the citadel got when the primary sun cleared the upper ramparts. It caught the copper in her hair and the iridescence in her amber gold skin and the silver in her eyes. I noticed all of that the way a physician notes physical detail, observationally, accurately, as part of building a complete picture. She said, "I want to complete the bloom cycle. I have wanted that since before the activation. The bloom has been dormant for 3 generations, and I have known since I was a child that I carried the marker, and that it might never activate because there were no compatible matches in the vel'kareth records. The possibility that it would activate was something I had spent 20 years learning not to want, because the wanting was a grief. And then it activated, because a human physician ran a panel correctly." I said nothing. She said, "The High Council's candidate is a reasonable man. He would do the role correctly. He would not be unkind. But the vel'sorath is not a political instrument. You said that yourself. And when I am honest in the plain sentences, the vel'sorath is not what I would be filing with him." I said, "What would you be filing?" She said, "A political accommodation, which is not nothing, but it is not what the charter means." I said, "And with me?" She looked at me for a long time. The silver-gray eyes were very still. Then she said, "I don't know you, Physician Sorrel. You have been in this citadel for 42 days. You have spoken to me in plain sentences and done your work correctly and asked questions that no one else asks. I know that is not a sufficient basis for a vel'sorath." I said, "No, but it might be a beginning." She said nothing. I said, "Here is my question, not the easy version, the real version. If I file a claim not for the charter's sake, not to prevent the dissolution, but because I mean it, because the thing that happened in this annex over 42 days was real and I want to see where it leads, would the vel'sorath be true?" The room was completely still. Then she said, "Yes." I filed the bonding claim that evening. vel'sorath Sem witnessed it. The filing went to the succession chamber clerk's office, to the High Council's review office, and to the Sovereign Medical Archive. The clerk's office confirmed receipt and logged it for the formal chamber proceeding. The High Council's office requested an emergency session. The succession chamber was the oldest room in the sovereign citadel. It was built in the original construction, gray-blue stone quarried from the vel'kareth eastern mountains, with columns that ran 30 meters to a vaulted ceiling, and a floor that had been worn smooth by 400 years of formal proceedings. The morning light came through narrow windows set high in the walls, throwing long pale rectangles across the stone, and the acoustics of the room were designed to carry a single voice to every corner without amplification. A design choice from an era before audio technology, which had the effect of making every word spoken in it feel weighted. It seated approximately 300, and on the morning of the hearing it was at capacity. I had not expected that. I had expected a formal legal proceeding with a small court staff and the principals. What I found when I took my position at the secondary claimant stand, a low platform to the right of the central floor, was that every seat was occupied, and that the noise level before the proceedings opened was approximately twice what I would have expected for a legal hearing. I stood at the secondary stand in my compact formal uniform, the gray with the physician's gold trim, and looked at the room and tried to breathe at an even pace. vel'sorath Sem had told me the night before that the chamber session had been listed in the public court schedule, which meant that any citizen with standing to attend a formal succession proceeding was entitled to come. He had said this in the specific tone of someone conveying information that is both accurate and inadequate. I had thanked him and spent 2 hours on the compendium's legal volumes before I stopped and decided that I already knew what I was going to say and that more reading would not make me more prepared. The High Counsel entered from the senior officials' corridor with 4 legal advocates and took his position at the primary challenge stand on the left side of the floor. He looked at me once, briefly, with the pale, colorless eyes. Then he looked at the front of the chamber. The Queen entered last. She came through the Sovereign's corridor, the wide passage at the far end of the chamber that opened directly onto the floor, with no stairs and no platform, so that the Sovereign walked into the chamber at the same level as everyone in it. She was in full court dress, ivory and copper, the formal braid set precisely, the vel'kareth sovereign seal at the collar in gold thread, and at the hem in a border that caught the chamber's morning light. She walked to the Sovereign's floor position, the center of the room, equidistant from both advocate stands, and stood. The chamber was silent before she reached her position. The silence was the specific kind that happens when a room full of people is collectively holding its breath. The chief clerk opened the proceedings. He read the relevant charter provisions. He outlined the High Counsel's challenge and the grounds, 3 legal arguments, carefully constructed, which I had read in the summary document the High Counsel's office had transmitted as required. He noted that the secondary claimant's filing was on record and would be addressed. Then he asked if the challenging party was prepared to present. The High Counsel rose. He was precise and thorough. He had been practicing vel'kareth law for longer than I had been alive, and it showed not in drama but in the careful architecture of his argument. He addressed each of the 3 challenge grounds in sequence. The first was historical. The dormant clause had been rendered effectively obsolete by subsequent charter amendments, none of which had explicitly preserved its operation. The second was procedural. The compatibility panel had been conducted under a compact health survey designation, and the activation of a vel'kareth succession mechanism through a compact procedure was categorically irregular. The third was substantive. The vel'sorath requirement of the ancient charter demanded a genuine recognition, and a compact physician who had been in the citadel for 42 days could not, by reasonable definition, meet that standard. He concluded by saying that the most appropriate resolution was the appointment of an approved regent and the formal suspension of the sovereign bloom activation, pending the charter amendment process. He sat down. The chief clerk asked if the secondary claimant wished to respond. I said yes. I had prepared notes. I looked at them once and then put them down, because the notes were for a version of this proceeding I had rehearsed, and this was a different room. I said, I am Davin Sorrell. I am a compact military physician. I have been in this citadel for 53 days. On day 42, I ran a routine compatibility panel as part of a standard compact health survey protocol, and the vel'kareth sovereign bloom activation registered. I did not know it was going to register. I did not plan for it to register. I documented the result correctly because documenting results correctly is my function, and the result went to the archive and to the High Counsel's review office because those were the terms of the filing agreement I had accepted when I was granted access to the Queen's medical record. I paused. I said, the High Counsel's legal arguments are technically sound. I have read them. He may be correct that the dormant clause has been superseded. He may be correct that the activation was procedurally irregular. Those are questions of vel'kareth law, and I am not a vel'kareth legal scholar. I said, but I want to address the third argument, the vel'sorath. The room was very still. I said, the ancient charter's language, as I read it in the original vel'kareth and in 3 available translations, says this. The vel'sorath is the recognition of a person as real, as genuinely present, genuinely themselves, genuinely worth the truth. It is not a duration. It is not a credential. It is not a political qualification. It is a question of whether the recognition is honest. I said, in 53 days, I have had approximately 40 medical consultations with the Queen. In those consultations, I have spoken to her in plain sentences about what I observed, what I measured, and what I concluded. I have not arranged my language around what I wanted her to feel. I have not managed my access to her on the basis of what it would do for my posting. I have tried to see her as my patient and tell her the truth about what I found. I said, I do not know if that is a vel'sorath. That is not a question I am in a position to determine, but I know it is not a political accommodation. And if the question is whether my recognition of her is honest, then yes, it is. I sat down. The chamber was quiet. The chief clerk was about to speak when the queen raised one hand, the formal gesture that in vel'kareth proceedings signaled that the sovereign wished to address the chamber directly. In a formal proceeding, this was unusual. The chief clerk paused. She spoke. She said, "The High Counsel's challenge raises legitimate legal questions. He is correct that the dormant clause may require clarification in the context of the current charter. I am prepared to authorize a formal charter review on those grounds." She paused. She said, "But the vel'sorath is not a legal question. The High Counsel argued that a physician who has known me for 53 days cannot meet the vel'sorath standard. I want to address that argument directly, because it is the argument that matters." The chamber was completely still. I could hear the ventilation system in the upper galleries. She said, "In 53 days, Physician Sorrel has spoken to me in plain sentences and told me what he found. He has asked me questions that this court does not ask. He has asked what I want, and has waited for the actual answer rather than the answer it was convenient for me to give. He has conducted himself as a physician whose function is to see his patient clearly and tell her the truth." She said, "The vel'sorath is the recognition of a person as real. I have been sovereign of this court for 9 years. In those 9 years, I can count on one hand the number of people who have spoken to me as if I were a person first and a position second. Physician Sorrel is one of them. That did not take 53 days to establish. It took 3 consultations." She said, "I am not invoking the ancient charter because it is legally convenient. I am invoking it because it is accurate. The bonding claim on record is valid. The sovereign bloom will complete on its own terms. And I am naming Davin Sorrel as the vel'sorath claimant before this chamber, not because the law requires it, but because it is true, and I will not stand in this room and pretend otherwise." The chamber did not erupt. It did not shout. It did not do any of the things you might expect from a room of 300 people who have just heard their sovereign make a declaration that overturns 190 years of succession dormancy. It went silent in a way that was different from the silence before. The silence before had been held breath. This silence was something that had no single word in any language I knew, the specific quiet of a room that has just heard something it was not certain it would ever hear, and is taking a moment to understand that it is real. I stood at the secondary claimant's stand in my compact gray uniform and looked at the floor and breathed. The High Counsel sat at the challenge stand with the pale, colorless eyes very still, and he said nothing for a long time. Then he said, to the chief clerk, in a voice that was entirely controlled, "I will need to review the charter language with my legal scholars before I determine whether to proceed with the formal challenge." The chief clerk said, "Of course, High Counsel." The proceeding was adjourned. I did not speak to the Queen in the chamber. There were protocols. After a formal proceeding, the sovereign was escorted through the sovereign's corridor, and the chamber floor was cleared by the clerk's staff, and the parties withdrew to their respective positions. I walked out through the secondary claimant's corridor and found vel'sorath Sem waiting in the passage. He looked at me with an expression that was professionally composed and also unmistakably not composed, and he said, "She is in the annex." I said, "Is she all right?" He said, "She asked for the annex specifically. She said it was where the plain sentences were." I walked to the annex. She was sitting on the examination platform. The formal braid was intact. The sovereign dress was still the full court ivory and copper. She had her hands in her lap and she was looking at the window, the same window where the afternoon light came in gold when the primary sun cleared the upper ramparts. But it was morning now and the light was different, cooler, the blue-white that preceded the gold. I came in and stood at the workstation and said nothing. The annex was quiet the way it always was in the mornings before the medical schedule began, a specific settled quiet that I had come to associate with the beginning of useful work. The equipment terminals ran their standby cycles. The ventilation moved clean, cool air through the bay. The Queen sat on the examination platform and looked at the window, and I stood at the workstation and waited, because I had learned that she said the things she meant in her own time, and that waiting was not a failure. After a moment she said, "The High Council will pursue the legal challenge. He is not a man who adjusts his plans quickly." I said, "I know." She said, "It may take months. The charter review will be complex. There will be political pressure. The noble houses with candidates in the succession queue will be active." I said, "I know." She said, "You understand you are not obligated to remain. Your posting agreement." I said, "Has a 30-day early termination provision." "Yes. The High Council mentioned it." She said, "And?" I said, "I'm not leaving." She was quiet. The morning light came through the window and lay across the examination platform and across her copper-red braid and the amber-gold skin and the silver-gray eyes that were looking at the window, not the middle distance now, but the actual window, the actual light, the actual morning outside. She said, "Plain sentences." I said, "Plain sentences." She said, "This is going to be complicated." I said, "Yes." She said, "I don't know how it ends." I said, "Neither do I, but I know what I observed in 53 days, and I know what I told the chamber, and both of those things are true. That's enough to start with." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "The vel'sorath record entry is filed. It is in the Sovereign Medical Archive and the Succession Chamber record and the High Council's review log. Whatever the legal challenge determines, the record is there." I said, "I know." She said, "The ancient charter's language on what comes next, after the vel'sorath is filed, is not language I have memorized. I know the broad shape of it. I do not know the particular provisions." I said, "I've been reading it." She turned her head from the window and looked at me for the first time since I came in. The silver-gray eyes had the precision in them that I had found unsettling at first and then found useful. And there was something else in them too, something I did not have a precise clinical name for but recognized clearly enough. I said, "We have time to read the rest together, if that is what you want." She said, "Plain sentences, physician Sorrel." I said, "Yes, that's what I mean." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she made the movement at the corner of her mouth that I had seen only once before, the faint thing that was close to a smile. She said, "Then yes, that is what I want." The morning light moved across the annex floor. Outside, the Citadel was beginning its day. The legal challenge was in the High Council's office. The charter review was scheduled for the following month. The noble houses were already meeting in their private chambers, according to vel'sorath Sem, who had sources in most of the senior house staffs, and regarded it as a professional obligation to know things before they were formally reported. None of that was in the annex. In the annex there was a physician and a queen and a morning window, and the patient record open on the workstation, because there was still work to do, and I intended to do it. I pulled up the compatibility baseline and checked the Bloom indicators, the way I had been checking them every morning since day 42. The numbers were the same as yesterday, steady, progressing as the literature described, in the way of a thing that has waited 190 years and is in no particular hurry now that it has finally begun. I noted the reading in the log. I noted the date. I noted the session was in the vel'kareth Imperial Medical Annex, Standard Morning Review, attending physician D. Sorrel. Then I closed the log and turned to my patient and asked her how she was feeling. She said, "Better than yesterday." I said, "Good, let's start there."